This is my 107th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge, and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is another kit build of Wills OO Scenic Series plastic kit SS48 timber signal box. My previous experiences with Wills kits have been mixed. I'm not a fan of the Wills Craftsman series kits, such as the farm cottage that I built in part 17 of this series. Some have taken me to task over this, saying something along the lines of these kits are intended for skilled modelers looking for an experience closer to scratch building. Well, yes, and that's all very well and good, and certainly you can build up a nice result from those kits, but you do have to essentially make many of the parts yourself, and they're not cheap, more expensive indeed than many kits offering much more complete materials. Now, I enjoy cooking, but I wouldn't patronize a restaurant that charged more than other neighboring restaurants offering excellent meals and then expected me to prepare the ingredients and cook the meal myself. And on that basis I won't be buying any more of the Wills Craftsman series kits. If I want to scratch build, I'll scratch build. When I want to build a kit, I'll go with one that offers me good value in the parts I'm paying for. Now, not all Wills kits are like that. Some, such as the SS20 kit for greenhouses and cold frames, which I built in part 85 of this series, offer fairly completely made parts for assembly, except for expecting you to cut glazing pieces to size yourself, which is something found in kits from many manufacturers. So I had mixed feelings approaching this signal box kit. I knew from my research before buying it that the kit could be built into quite a nice looking model, and that the kit did essentially provide you with parts for assembly rather than expecting you to make the parts yourself. Well, spoiler alert, having built it, I wouldn't recommend this kit, not to anybody I liked anyway. It does offer some quite well made parts, and it can be built into quite a nice looking model. But I didn't enjoy working with it. To be blunt, I found it a pain in the rear to paint, and in many respects a pain in the rear to assemble. If you're very good at extremely fine painting, that may not offer so much of an impediment to you. For myself, the painting requirements of this kit were pretty much beyond my skill level, and I struggled to produce an acceptable result. But the kit offers other impediments beyond the difficulty of painting, which we'll come to as we go along in this video. Ultimately, I don't think it's worth it. Better to go with one of the alternatives in the way of signal box kits. But I'll do my best to show what's involved with this kit so you can always make up your own mind. Here's the kit as it comes. It's nicely boxed, so the parts are well protected. The chap on the cover looks a bit like my dad. The glasses certainly seem to be from the period of my youth in the 1950s and 60s. I have a theory that they put this picture on the box to make you feel guilty when you struggle with building the kit, but perhaps I'm being too Freudian. There is a colour picture of the finished model, but it's rather small. I consulted this often to confirm aspects of the build, and I would have much preferred if most of the box cover had been devoted to a larger colour picture of the finished model. As regards the text on the box, I'd give them the finely detailed plastic moulding bit, but I dispute the easily assembled. Here's what you get when you unpack the kit. 3 sprues of white plastic parts, 2 sprues of grey plastic parts, 1 sprue of brown plastic parts, a rectangular sheet of clear acetate for glazing, a folded sheet of instructions, and a sheet with exploded diagrams. Here's a closer view of the instructions and diagrams. I struggled to understand some parts of the instructions, but mostly they were fairly detailed and appropriate. Here are the grey and brown sprues and the glazing sheet. Mostly the parts were crisply cast with very little flash. Here are the white sprues for the cabin walls and the windows. Here are the parts for the cabin walls seen from the outer side. These presented the first problem with this kit, at least for me. They required some very tricky painting, as the timber framing and the windows and doors need to be picked out in a colour of your choice, probably a darker colour, whilst the background timbering appears in a lighter colour. This demands a lot of painting with a steady hand, with lots of potential for problems. Or I suppose you could try to get the two-colour effect by masking and spray painting. I did consider that, but it seemed that a great deal of quite awkward masking would be required, and that would probably offer as much potential for mess-ups as hand painting. I took these parts down to the basement to spray on a base colour for the background timbers. I don't spray at my workbench. Whilst the base colour on the walls was drying, I worked on the windows. There was a little flash on some of the window frames, as can be seen here, so I cleaned that up first. I cut appropriately sized pieces of clear acetate to glaze all of the windows. I cut the pieces just a little smaller than the outside of the window frames themselves. The windows had flat backs, so it was fairly easy to glue on the acetate glazing pieces with poly cement. And you can see all of the frames glazed here. I tried to get the light to reflect so you could see the glazing. Here are the walls back from initial spray painting them. I painted them a sort of beige. Actually, the colour was labelled sand grey. It seemed to be the most suitable colour that I had on hand. Then I did my best to paint the timber frames, doors, etc. I'm afraid that my best wasn't very good. This kind of painting is really beyond my skill level. It only takes the slightest unwanted shake of the hand to get dark paint where you don't want it, and you can see that I've made some blotches whilst failing to colour everything that I should have. I did a bit more touching up, trying to hide my blotches and fill in my omissions. I could have gone round in circles doing this for a very long time. I did do some more touching up of the paint at various stages in the assembly, and I still ended up with blotches and omissions on my final model. I was thinking of attaching the windows to the walls first, but the instructions said to assemble the walls together first, and I figured that I'd better do as they said, as there might be issues with the fit of the windows that wouldn't be clear if the windows were fitted to the walls before their assembly. So, as the instructions said to, I started by attaching the right side of the cabin to the back wall. The cabin floor can then be glued in on top of the ribs in the middle of the walls. This will keep the walls square. I did think about painting the floor, but I decided I wasn't going to fuss about the interior of this box, as it will hardly be seen at all. The left end of the box with the doors can then be glued to the back wall and to the floor. Then the front of the box can be glued to the two sides and the floor. There was nothing too problematic about this assembly, although I did manage to mess up my painting somewhat, and the painting would have needed touching up after this assembly anyway because of the way the walls attach together at the corners. You can see what I mean here. The edges of the front and back walls were exposed in the assembly, and I hadn't painted those because I didn't know that I needed to. So I did my best to touch up the painting again. Here are the instructions for the windows. Well, the first part of them anyway. There's more on the next sheet. Here's the rest of the instructions re the windows. I struggled at length, but I really couldn't make any sense of that business about the narrow edge windows versus the sliding windows. As best as I can understand the instructions, 2 of these are supposed to be sliding windows and the other 2 are supposed to be narrow edge windows. Can you tell which are which? I really couldn't. I think I used the 2 at right as the sliding windows, leaving the 2 at left to serve as narrow edge windows. The larger window pieces glued into place at the bottom of the front wall and at centre top. These fitted in place quite straightforwardly, being aligned with the openings manually by viewing from the outside as the parts were placed and adjusted before the glue set. The sliding windows glued to ridges cast into the walls above and below their openings. This worked quite well, though I did need to clean some paint off those ridges so that the poly cement would be able to work. And here are those front sliding windows in place. Now, this is where we come to needing the narrow edge windows. As you can see here, the left edge of the left window in the far wall is going to have to be very narrow indeed to fit against the sliding window in the front wall. The narrow edges needed to be much narrower than anything on any of the window parts as they came. The instructions did say that the narrow edges might need to be cut down, and they certainly did need to be cut down a lot. Once its edge was cut down, that window fitted in place okay, although the paint is getting messed up again. Then the same thing had to be done for the other corner, the window frame edge cut down to fit, and the window fitted in place. Then the windows next to those narrow edge windows could be fitted. Finally, there were two small windows, one for the door as seen here, and the other for the ground floor of the far end wall. Next came the end platform and steps. This was where things started to get really hairy. I thought at first that the end platform was going to fit on top of that ridge under the door, but it turned out I was wrong. The end platform is intended to fit under the ridge below the door and over the small ridge at the bottom of the cross timber. Unfortunately, it was very difficult to persuade the platform to fit, as the part seemed determined to warp. I eventually ended up using cyanoacrylate glue to hold it in place in some approximation to straightness. The railings then glued to the side of the steps. I'm pretty sure this is how they were supposed to go, with the bottom rail glued directly to the side of the riser and the bottom post butted up against the bottom of the riser, as indicated in the instructions. Here are the instructions relating to the end platform, the steps and the railings. I glued the other railing to the other side of the steps. This was fiddly, but simple compared to what was to come. The steps then glued to the centre of the platform. It was at this point that I ended up CAing the platform in place. Now, the railing pieces are supposed to be glued in place, attached at the corner of the platform and the top of the step railing. Persuading this to stay in place was a devil of a job. The railing on the other side attaches the same way, if you can manage it. I certainly struggled. And it only gets worse, because then you're expected to glue little rails in place by their ends between the posts on the corners and the walls. There are no slots or anything for these to fit into. I really struggled with this part of the assembly, and I see that I didn't get the posts at the top of the steps the right distance apart either. Next, the roof went on. This was a tricky process as well. The instructions did caution that the ridge piece should be fitted at the same time as the main roof tile sections, and that was indeed essential, because there was nothing in the way the roof tiles attached to the walls that would ensure that the separation at the top of the roof would be the right size for the ridge piece. So you could only get the fit right if you fitted all three pieces at the same time. I noticed after I did this that two different ridge pieces were provided on the sprue. This was the plainer one. There was another that had more in the way of moulded tiling. If that was discussed in the instructions, I missed it. At centre here are the parts for the gutters and downpipes. Wills didn't bother to actually cast the downpipes in the shape they needed to be. They just made them straight. Then they told you to bend them so that they would actually fit. Most manufacturers, for example Ratio in the previous single box kit that I built, managed to actually cast the parts in the shape they're supposed to be. The downpipes weren't very well made anyway, being totally flat on one side, so there was a limit to how well they were ever going to represent pipes. I did my best to fit them in place in a way that looked sort of sensible without getting too fancy about it. Note that barge boards have also been fitted under the ends of the roof. I did paint those to match the timber framing. The piece in front of the bottom of the front wall also needed to be bent to shape, but this at least had grooves indicating where the bend should be. In reality, this would be to cover the rodding coming out of the front of the box. At this point I also glued the stove chimney to the roof, having painted it with gunmetal paint. I printed a name for the box on my PC, though I managed to glue it in place slightly crooked. It is rather obvious that the interior of the box is just empty here, but this is a flash picture. I don't think it will be very noticeable in normal layout operations. So there it is outside my far shelf layout station. Definitely not my finest build, but I guess I can live with the result. As I've said, I couldn't in good conscience recommend this kit, but obviously if you can deal with the issues and it provides what you want, it's up to you.